There we go. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to the November 7th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting at MakerDAO. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community developments. Let's do the preambles first, and then I'll talk about the agenda, because it's weird if I mix it up. We are super keen to hear from everybody in this call, so if you have something to contribute, please do type a question in the chats. We'll get to it as soon as there's a lull in the conversation. If you have access to a microphone, you don't need to wait for a lull. You can just interrupt us. So feel free to jump in at any points. One thing I keep on forgetting, but I want to reiterate this. You MakerDAO employees that have been sneaking into this call, I want to hear from you as well. So if you have things to contribute, if you have questions, this is a great place to ask it. It doesn't have to be behind closed doors. We're all friends here. So if you have something to add, please do. In today's call, we are going to talk about governance, and then we're going to talk about risk. Quelle surprise. Cyrus is going to do a bit of a recap on the migration risk construct, and then we're going to dig into the wild and mind-bogglingly complicated world of auctions. I don't know if I should have framed it that way, but so here, let me do a caveat. I find it enormously complicated. Perhaps there's people in the room smarter than me who will not. And then we are going, actually, and then I'm going to talk about some governance issues with my general squishy philosophical take on things that cannot be quantified. So let's just jump into that. I'll try to make it as fast as I possibly can. We have some things that have happened recently. How's that for an opener? So let's talk about these things. The thing is that through the heroic efforts of LongForWisdom, he shepherded an initiative through the forums over the course of a month or two. I think that thing took, where we learned a lot of really interesting things. We learned about how the community comes together to make something happen and to move the not move the ecosystem necessarily. That might be too grandiose, but they certainly moved MakerDAO. And the way that they moved MakerDAO was deciding how we handle debt ceilings. Should the situation ever arise where we hit the debt ceiling, the presumption was we should probably raise that debt ceiling, which I think was probably a good idea. I don't know. I'm not a risk analyst, but so that proposal went through the system. And what that did, and I've touched on this last week, but I want to touch on it again because it's important. This is the first time that the community has empowered an actor that's been ratified by the community, namely me, to take action based on activity in the ecosystem and then do something, that's fairly big, because generally always we have a poll, reach out about, or we have a forum post, and then we have a poll, and then we have a vote, and then something happens. The proposal stated that in the event that we hit or we come within 10 million of the existing debt ceiling, the interim governance facilitator, namely myself, is empowered to skip the forum post, skip the poll, and simply put in an executive or tack on a new parameter to the weekly executive, which is maintain that 10 million buffer. That happened this week, which is fascinating. So great, the system works, but here's what I want to talk about specifically, because I was chatting about this in the Rocket chat yesterday. I'm going to make a forum post so a wider audience is able to follow along with the debate, but I'm also going to recap it a bit here. We have some stress cracks forming in our governance system, and those cracks will become more apparent as the weeks and months progress, particularly post-MCD, where we need to have a system that's flexible, but also capable of handling unexpected situations. And here's an example of an unexpected situation. That proposal stated that we maintain a $10 million buffer, and the threshold for that is if we hit that minimum threshold for even so much as a block. And then we thought about that, we chatted about it, and we debated it for a month or two, like I said. But immediately we ran into a situation that nobody had anticipated. So this is where we need to start figuring out how we do governance in the future. The situation we didn't anticipate was what happens if we get greater than a 10 million increase in the debt ceiling or the circulating die, and then we have to bump it by 20 million instead of 10. during the course of the week. And that's the situation we ran into. So we discovered, this is something that I like to talk about a bit semi-facetiously, but it's not really all that facetious. So in the crypto space, where we have a tendency to reinvent a lot of things. We're kind of reinventing the financial world. We're reinventing economies. We're reinventing how insurance works. We're reinventing, like the list goes on. We're also, probably this might be a bit revealing a bit of our hubris, but we're also in the process of reinventing how governance works. I think we all understand how tricky a problem that is. So MakerDAO, our philosophy is let's be conservative about that and take it step by step. But over the course of the last couple of days, we've also reinvented the judiciary, which is I hadn't seen that one coming. So here's the problem. We have a proposal out there. That proposal doesn't encounter or doesn't contemplate a series of what ifs, and that's one of the reasons why law books are so big, is because they do contemplate what ifs. Ours didn't. So the what if is, what if it goes up 20 million, or what if it goes up 10.1 million, or what if we need to do this, what if we need to do that. So the situation as it stands is there's no specific language in that proposal that states that the increase has to be or is bound to be within 10 million of the previous ratified debt ceiling. I encourage people to dig into that proposal in the forums and see what they have to think about it. My interpretation, this is where we get into the judiciary, is my interpretation of that proposal is that we need to maintain a 10 million buffer. And that buffer is dependent on whatever the current circulating amount of number of DAI is. So if we look at the intention of the proposal, my reading states that we move to 120 as a cap this Friday for a scheduled vote. So there we go. Ambiguity already in the system. Sorry, I got distracted. It's ambiguity in the system. The judiciary has come into effect. I'm enormously reluctant to make judgment calls when it comes to a governance facilitator role, so I'm trying to be as conservative as possible. It's my belief that that's what the community wanted. There's a debate to be had there, though. Here's another example of ambiguity. There's been some discussion about why are we waiting? Why don't we just do an executive right now, or yesterday, or tonight, or tomorrow? And here's my concerns. We have a cadence in our ecosystem where people expect a poll on a Monday, they expect a vote on a Friday, they expect a call on a Thursday. For us and or me and or a couple people in the chat to decide that cadence is now going to be altered because we've determined that there's an emergency makes me super nervous. Because anybody who's familiar or ever been stuck in a meeting with me, you know that I'm the king of questions. So first thing I ask is, what's an emergency? According to who? And how do you measure that? And what are the appropriate responses? And so we need to start thinking about some stuff, because the numbers were thrown out. So if the peg deviates by 1% over 6 hours, 2% over 12 hours, okay, now we have an emergency. But I need more eyes on that decision, because emergency for who? There's more questions, and if you come up with an answer to that, I'll give you a couple more. So this stuff's complicated. There's additional risks. If we decide that, okay, we've now clarified what an emergency is, now we have an emergency, so we're going to do an executive on Tuesday afternoon, that raises some more concerns for me. So we already have, we're every week we give the ecosystem homework. Read up on your MakerDAOs, watch all the YouTubes, try to figure out what's happening in the forum, make an informed decision, get yourself prepared, move your keys, and then do some work on Friday in order to protect the system. That's a pretty big ask, and that's something that we need to think about in the future. How do we optimize that process a bit? But how big does that ask become if we tell the community through our actions that, you know what, we're going to have an executive whenever, so you better be watching the system all the time. I'm not sure whether that's going to be a thing that we can expect. So that's something to think about. And that ties back to my extreme reluctance to exercise any kind of emergency powers or special abilities that are tied up in the governance facilitator role. I think that it needs to be the backstop and an administrative and bureaucratic role, paper pushing role as opposed to making a decisions role as much as humanly possible. So having said all that, there's a middle ground here, and that middle ground is if there is a sense of urgency on implementing the debt ceiling executive sooner rather than later, what we can do is fire that thing up right after this call. Because if we do that, we will not have 2 executives this week. We'll just have our Friday executive slightly earlier, one that will roll up the this week's stability fee and this week's debt ceiling into the same vote we would have had tomorrow, but we'll just do it today instead. No harm, no foul. That just gives people an extra day to respond and an extra day to deliberate. I am keen on that idea, and I don't think that's an abuse of power or an overreach, so I'm going to try and make that happen. But here's actually, that was going to lead me into my next point, but I think I might have lost the thread here. Yeah, well, actually, yeah, okay, well, I'll see if I can come back to it. But we've talked about there's the cadences, there's the expectations from the community, there's an exercise of power that I'm uncomfortable with, and that eventually the community might become uncomfortable with as well. But it's something that we need to figure out in the future. Let's debate in the forums or in the chats, preferably in the forums, and then see what that looks like. But I'm going to leave it. Actually, I'm about to start speechifying, so I'm going to cut myself off. But what I do want to do is I want to leave this question with the community, and I'm going to touch on this more probably weekly. I'm not going to stop talking about it until something happens. Here's the idea: we need to perform an audit here. We need to think very carefully about the governance system that we have. The tooling that we have, the mechanisms that we have. We need to think about polling. We need to think about continuous approval. We need to think about this weekly cadence, and we need to imagine a little bit what the future might look like, not too far in the future. And we also need to figure out what it is, pain points we've had in the past, because we're about to head into a very different universe than the one that we occupy currently. Okay, maybe I'll give myself another 5 minutes. I have that. I'll exercise that power. Right now we have a single universe. We've deliberated and debated and optimized for us to pull lever weekly to manage the stability fee in single collateral DAO. Very, very soon, 2 weeks-ish, we're going to have 2 universes. I don't know, let's call it five levers that we need to worry about right off the bats. We have stability fees in one for ETH SCD, ETH MCD, BAT MCD. We have the DSR. We have some initial auction parameters. We have debt ceilings in 2 different ecosystems. So we need to figure out that stuff with the system and the tooling and the cadences that we've built for ourselves. And we're going to see problems with that system. So this is the opportunity for us to start iterating a little faster than we have been on what we need from governance and how governance should operate, and what kind of tooling we need from that system. So let's keep that in the back of our minds. And as we run into frictions, let's get a forum post up or a proposal or maybe a mini initiative or a working group together, and let's figure out how to improve this world that we live in. I think I might leave it there. That's enough to digest for now. Cyrus, I'm going to hand it off to you. You want to tell us a bit about what's happening in the risk world.
Cool. Today we are going to talk about auctions and a little bit of migration risk. Give me a second to share my screen. All right. But before we get into that, let's just do a final or second to last recap on migration risk. Earlier this week, we posted a proposal to the forums in the form of a governance poll for basically a migration strategy along with a set of launch parameters. The document had a few different talking points. One was how to manage two different pegs, both the single collateral and multi-collateral dies. Talked about the DSR a little bit and what we're doing to incentivize migration from the old system to the new system, and kind of the overarching risk theme was Psi liquidity, both for CDP owners who need to source Psi to migrate, and maybe even more importantly, the secondary borrowers who may not easily make use of our migration contract. Encourage everybody to give it a read if you're some sort of stakeholder in the Maker or DeFi ecosystem. I'm not going to spend too much time on this today, but I just wanted to see if there were any questions on migration risk before we moved on to auctions. Generally, the theme is Psi liquidity. So yeah, we are trying to get Psi holders to migrate over as soon as possible. That would kind of gather up liquidity for CDP owners who want to migrate over, and then secondaries can hopefully use the contract as well. And if not, they'll have to go to the public markets to source Psi, and that shouldn't be a problem in the early days, but I encourage everybody to migrate as soon as they are comfortable and ready and willing, because eventually when liquidity dries up for Psi, emergency shutdown will have to be triggered. Cool. Well, there's been plenty of discussion on this so far, and as always, reach out on the forums or in the chat or anywhere, and we can help with that. But today we're mainly going to talk about auctions. Auctions are a new construct in MCD, and there's three types of them. One is collateral auctions, where keepers bid DAI for collateral. This replaces that 3% fixed discount in the current SCD structure. There will be surplus auctions, which is where the collected stability fees in DAI go towards a surplus auction where users bid MKR in exchange for that DAI. And then there are the debt auctions, which happens when bad debt accrues due to under-collateralized loans, and MKR needs to be minted to cover that shortfall. Couple general rules for how the auctions work. Auctions in a blockchain world are a little bit confusing at times. I'll try to do our best to explain it. And yeah, a few weird things. One is bids can't be canceled. Once a keeper places a bid for an auction, it's there. I mean, of course, someone else can come in and outbid them, but you can't change your mind, which kind of implies that the auctions have to end promptly due to market risk, right? You don't want to place a bid there and then have it be stuck for hours while the market moves against you. So intuitively, there needs to be a mechanism for auctions to end somewhat quickly. The auctions are expected to be primarily bot-driven at launch. I know this may be disappointing to some. It was for me, because I was interested in potentially participating in some of these auctions, but there won't even be any GUIs at launch, and there are some compelling arguments for why it makes sense for it to be entirely bot-driven at first. That could change in time, potentially. We'll just kind of have to see. But what that means is a lot of these parameters are designed for algorithmic market makers. And finally,
Sorry, can I interrupt you? What was sure. Like you said, there's compelling reasons. Do you have an example?
They probably have just much better liquidity reserves than human market makers. And I think, and these auctions can trigger at any random time. There's no preset time for when the auctions occur. They could happen in the middle of the night or depending. So it really requires some sort of systematic maintenance there. Whether that aspect could be changed, I suppose these auctions are completely modular and they can be designed a million different ways. For now, I'm just kind of want to talk less about kind of what the options are for improving the auction structure and just kind of focus on how we can make the most of what we have in front of us right now.
Mm.
Okay, so let's start with the collateral auction. A few different parameters to be aware of here. One is the lot size per auction. So when a CDP is bitten, the entire collateral amount is not put up in the form of one auction. For example, and this makes sense because some of these large CDPs that have millions of dollars in collateral, right? If that was all to be one auction, then well, there'd be a very small subset of people who could participate in that auction. I guess a caveat I should have mentioned in the previous page is that keepers must bid the full amount of the auction. They must try to take down the full lot size of the auction. You can't bid for only a partial amount. So to compensate for that, a large CDP will be broken down into multiple auctions. So if it was a large one and then there's only like 2 people who can bid, then they can bid an extreme discount to that auction, knowing that very few other people can actually participate. Now, the downside of subdividing these auctions is that they take longer. There's only so many auctions you can fit into a single block. So for example, if you wanted to make it something really accessible, say $100, and you had $1 million CDP, then that would be 10,000 auctions, which is obviously a UX issue there. So there's a bit of a trade-off of what you want to make that lot size to be. I'll talk about what we've chosen in a moment. Then these next are probably the 2 most important parameters from a game theory perspective. The first is the bid duration. The bid duration is a quantity of time where after which, if no one has outbid you, then the auction ends early and you win the auction. So for example, if the bid duration is set to 10 minutes and Rich comes in and bids on an auction, the rest of the market has 10 minutes to decide if they want to outbid him before the auction will end. This parameter is a trade-off between network risk and market risk. So if this number was set too high, say an hour, then the keeper will be exposed to 1 hour of market risk, which may be undesirable. The market could move against him, and he will probably price in his expected volatility in the form of a discount, and he'll just underbid the auction, and the maker protocol will end up receiving less DAI. Now, if that number is too low, you run into other risks, primarily network issues, block times, full blocks, high gas prices, and so on. And then you run the risk of an auction ending without anyone bidding, and then the entire debt would go to a debt auction, which is also undesirable. Any questions on those first 2? Okay, and then the bid increment is, so basically if you look on the centralized exchanges, if you're bidding on ETH on Coinbase, for example, you can bid every penny increment. So you can bid like 180 and a penny and so on. The size of that increment has some pretty important implications for the auction. So if it's set too low, then what can happen is keepers can come in at the last second and outbid the current winning bid by an extremely small amount, delaying the auction, making it somewhat of an annoying UX for all the keepers. On the other hand, if it was set really high, say you could only bid in $10 increments, then if the ETH price is, say, 190 and you can only bid in $10 increments, then the very first keeper could come in and bid 182, for example, and then he would automatically guarantee himself a win because the following bid would be higher than what the collateral is worth in the first place. If that wasn't clear, I'm going to do an example right after this. And then there's a max auction duration, which is primarily a safety measure because the expectation is that the auctions will end from the bid durations pretty much 100% of the time. Okay, let's just jump right. Sure.
So I had a question about auction participants, or who's going to be the primary participants. Is there documentation available that, if I don't know, an average trader, but I know Ethereum and I can participate?
Yeah.
Or is it open?
Yeah, there's plenty of documentation out there. There's even open source auction bots for users to spin up to participate in these auctions. There's plenty of documentation out there, I'm hoping. Yep. David just linked to one. Oh, and Kenton just linked to the open source bot that I was referring to. Okay, so here's an example of a typical collateral auction. So let's assume that there's 100, and everybody get out your pen and paper. Let's assume you have 100 DAI debt. Collateral is 1 ETH. Price is at 180, and then all of a sudden the price crashes to 120. So this CDP is liquidated. At this point, the liquidation penalty is applied. This is also a tunable parameter, which we'll talk about some other time. And so now the Maker protocol says it needs to recover 113 DAI based on this current $120 worth of collateral. Now, the collateral auctions have 2 phases in them. So the first phase is a keeper would come in and they say, I'll bid 50 DAI for this $120 worth of collateral. Now, if this ends up being the winning bid, he wins the ETH, and Maker goes, they have a 63 DAI shortfall because they were trying to recover this 113 and they only get 50. So this would result in 63 of bad debt. Now another keeper comes in and he says, I'll bid 113 DAI, which is what's needed for this 1 ETH, which is worth $120, and they will turn a $7 profit, but the CDP owner basically loses all of his collateral, which may be undesirable. And so the auction then, so once this maximum DAI to be recovered is bid on, the auction moves into the second phase, where then additional bids will say, I'm still willing to bid 113 DAI and I'm okay with accepting less collateral. So another keeper will come in and say, I'll bid 113 for 0.99 ETH, and then another one will come in and say, I'll accept 0.98 ETH. This is a typo here, that should be keeper D. And basically, if this ends up being the winning bid, then the keeper pays 113 DAI for 0.98 ETH. He still turns a profit, and the CDP owner will get back the balance of their collateral, which in this example is 0.02 ETH. Is that clear for everyone? Just how the auctions work? So
in the absence of anybody who's not on the payroll asking a question, I'll do one. Cyrus, maybe this is a question for Ed or one of the architects of the system or somebody who's familiar with auctions. Is there a name for whatever this is? Like, is this a new kind of auction, or is this like some kind of inverted upside down Dutch auction or something? Like, can we do research on how these mechanisms work externally to make it?
Yeah, I think I'm not an auctions expert myself, but I think it's a English auction.
English, is that what it is?
Which is, I think, it's just a standard auction. So this first phase is fairly. This is how everybody intuitively thinks of auctions, right? Just increasing bid amounts for what's up for sale. That's just what everybody thinks of when they see auction. The second part is kind of the weirder part, where now people start basically saying how little of the total amount they're happy to walk away with.
Okay. This stuff's endlessly fascinating. I'm just wondering if there's additional like external resources.
Yeah, there is. But I'm probably not the person to.
Yeah, maybe we'll leave it there and revisit later.
Okay. So the proposed parameters we have for the collateral auction, lot size is around 10. We targeted about 10 grand. This kind of hits that balance between endlessly creating too many small auctions versus something that is easy for most keepers and market makers to absorb. The minimum bid increment of the bid duration of 10 minutes is also a happy middle ground between network issues and market risk. The minimum bid increment of 3% was designed to closely mimic the current SCD structure as closely as possible, given that basically if somebody comes within 97% of the collateral amount, then it's not rational for anyone to outbid them. So it kind of guarantees a 3% profit somewhat. Safety measure of auction duration 3 days, and a liquidation penalty of 13%. All right, moving on to the surplus auction. Users will bid MKR for a preset amount of DAI. A lot of the parameters have basically the same intuition as the collateral auction. One that's different is the bid duration. So the bid duration was the one that exposes you to market risk, but surplus auctions don't happen in the midst of collateral crashes or just general market volatility. So we can extend this a little bit to be a little bit safer. And then the surplus auctions trigger when the lot size is reached above a surplus buffer, which is a system parameter, which we'll probably talk about next week. But essentially, the buffer is the amount of DAI reserves, which is something voted on by governance as well.
Cyrus, can you actually go back to that slide and just explain that third point about surplus auctions not occurring during market volatility? What exactly does that mean?
Sure. So ETH auctions happen when ETH is crashing, and that's the least likely time that keepers want to have their bid stuck in the market for like an hour, for example, right? They want those auctions to end quickly. But the surplus auctions occur kind of uniformly when stability fees are collected, and they should happen very uniformly, which means that it's much less likely that that the surplus auctions will occur during any sort of market volatility. And in any case, the surplus auctions get worse when the MKR price is increasing rather than decreasing, actually. It's an MKR rally that I think is the market risk, because they end up overbidding for the preset die amount.
Got it. So it's not that they don't occur; it's just that they occur less efficiently or like weirdly, because they're still going to be occurring so long as like the threshold is hit, the auction's going to be launched, people are going to be bidding.
Yeah. Sorry, the wording isn't clear. It's just they're less likely to. Pretty much all collateral auctions will occur during volatility, almost by definition. This is almost the reverse, is that they'll almost never happen during volatility. The surplus auctions are extremely straightforward. So if you have if you're bidding on 10,000 die lot size and say the MKR price is $500, then maybe the first keeper comes in, he bids 16 MKR, which is about $8,000. Second guy comes in, he says, I'll bid 8,500. And then third guy comes in and bids 18 MKR, which is 9,000. And if he wins the auction, keeper will earn $1,000. This is kind of straightforward as it might get. Proposed lot size 10,000 die. Again, we're trying to keep these standardized. As I said, bid duration a little bit longer, 30 minutes, with the bid increment and the auction duration remain the same.
For the surplus auctions, the lot size being 10,000, I thought, is that the current proposed parameters? Because I thought that we were proposing like 50,000 or 500,000.
That's for the debt auction, and I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Let me stop and look at some questions in the chat. Is there anything that needs to be addressed?
It seems like mostly commentary at this point, talking about the utility of UIs. Nothing.
This is Lawson Baker. In the bidding auction process, is there a locking of the die at that time period that would necessary to purchase it? How exactly is that locked?
In the surplus auction?
Yes.
So in the surplus auction, the die is what you're bidding on. So that's just sitting in the protocol has a reserve pool where it collects the accrued die from the collected die from stability.
I apologize. Whatever the asset is you're purchasing with, is there a locking of that asset when you submit your bid?
Yeah. It's all smart contract based. So you'll bid some amount of MKR, and that MKR is locked. Well, it's permanently locked. You cannot cancel those bids. And then so either you win after 10 minutes, or in this case after 30 minutes, or somebody outbids you.
And if there are multiple bids for the same amount, is that split pro rata in any way, or first in line? How does that manage?
If I'm, hopefully Deb can correct me, but I'm pretty. Oh no, each new bid has to hit the minimum bid increment. So
first in line.
First in line.
Okay, I liken this. So I used to originate fixed income bonds and leases, and I liken this to like receiving bids for assets that are all like the same, but maybe in different amounts. And it seems like there could be an approach where you can account for that based off of some sort of mechanism to either prorate or have I guess you could have like a parameter, like I'm willing to in my bid I'm willing to also pay this amount more or less, and then when you're creating the book when you're originating, you kind of look at like, what has this person done with me recently? And I imagine there's a lot of potential reputation built up in keepers, and you could kind of create you could see a process in the future where it would look at those type of parameters to share equally and also account for regular keepers. Just a thought. Obviously, that would take a lot more thought and design changes, but it feels a lot like that process where you're trying to account for multiple people in a similar fashion, similar bids.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, I agree, there's a lot of time to get there because these parameters are all subject to change as well. And the choice of parameters really has some pretty big implications on how the auctions turn out. So I'd imagine that we'd have to kind of standard or optimize these numbers before any type of reputation emerges anyways. But yeah, good point. Okay, last section, we'll go into the debt auction. And then as part of this section, also going to talk a little bit about some issues that came up in the governance poll. And I'll get to that at the end, but that's kind of an important thing to talk about as well. So the debt auctions is kind of the MKR backstop that everybody is familiar with. Collateral crashes, doesn't raise enough DAI, and now MKR needs to be minted and sold off to cover the shortfall, right? A lot of the parameters have the same exact logic as the collateral auction, so I won't run through those again. There is one additional feature here, which is kind of interesting. So if there was some small amount of bad debt, even something as low as $1, right? If a keeper could come in and say, I'm willing to bail out this shortfall for 1 DAI, and in return, I want 1 trillion MKR. And there otherwise wouldn't have been anything to stop such a scenario from happening, which is obviously extremely dangerous. And because who knows how easy it is for a single auction to get overlooked. So there is this notion of the maximum amount of MKR that could be requested or minted per auction. So if you're trying to bail out $100 worth of bad debt, then the protocol might impose a limit and say, that's great, but we're not going to mint more than 5 MKR for this. And then if that number is too low, then the auction can reinitialize and increase that initial maximum bid amount. Maybe that's confusing, so I'll try to go through an example again. So let's say you have a 10,000 DAI shortfall, and the MKR price is 500, and you may set the maximum initial bid to 50. And this is about $25,000. So now the situation we want to avoid is a keeper coming in and saying, I'll cover that 10,000 shortfall, but I want 5,000 MKR in return, which is something absurdly high. And this number could have been arbitrarily large, but this is now an invalid request amount. The maximum that they could request is this parameter here. So the keeper comes in and he bids 10,000 DAI and he says, I want 25 grand worth of MKR. This would represent a huge profit for him. So another keeper comes in, and this is kind of like a reverse bidding auction. Next guy comes in, he says, I'll bid 10,000 DAI and I'll accept only 30 MKR in return, and so on. And it'll probably converge somewhere close to 10,000 plus some spread for liquidity and profit. So maybe the last keeper comes in and requests 25 MKR, which is about 12,500. Now, if this first bid is too low and you have no bids, then the auction will restart, and this bid will be increased by a percentage. So in this case, 20%, and that percentage discount or increase to the maximum allowable MKR received is also a parameter tunable by governance. So does that make sense? This kind of reverse auction, this reverse format, and this maximum. So if this maximum initial bid was not here, then we might accidentally print an enormously high amount of MKR, which is extremely undesirable.
So this is basically like phase 2 of the collateral auction, where
It is.
yeah,
It is exactly
that.
like it's exactly like phase 2 of the collateral auction, where you're agreeing to bid the full amount that's needed to be raised, and you're just saying what's the least amount of MKR you're willing to walk away with. Now, in the collateral auction, this isn't necessary because the most that they could walk away with is whatever is in the collateral from the CDP. But because this MKR is minted on the spot, you need to implement a limit hard-coded into the protocol. This lot size is also similar to the others. So if you were to have like $1 million DAI shortfall, then it would be split into 100 different auctions for the same reasons as the others. Okay, cool. So the proposed parameters are also pretty standard, except fairly recently we made a change to the lot size where we increased it from 10,000 to 50,000 because there was this extremely minor edge case with the DSR during migration, where if you had a bunch of SI holders migrate over and start earning the DSR, then you might accidentally trigger one of these debt auctions because there would be no offsetting stability fees potentially. Assume SI holders migrate over, they earn the DSR, but no CDP owners migrate over, then we could have triggered a debt auction. And so we decided to increase this parameter for the migration cycle and to be lowered once migration is kind of behind us. And that would correspond with an increase to the maximum initial bid as well. And this kind of gets into the last part of the presentation. We have to talk a bit about some governance issues that have come up. And both of these are my fault, and I'm sorry about that. Fortunately, both of these are relatively minor issues and easily fixable. This won't affect launch in any way. But we probably do need to come to consensus on a short-term solution, and then we can discuss how to make sure this doesn't happen again. The first problem is something I talked about in the forums a couple days ago. The list of parameters in the governance pool has a missing parameter, which is the debt auction bid duration. Technically, governance voted on an incomplete set of parameters. Normally, there are or would have been a few options on how to deal with that. And that's kind of what the point of that forum post is, to gauge feedback. But unfortunately, due to the second issue, I don't think there's any good options left other than running a cleanup governance poll on Monday. So essentially that maximum bid amount for the debt auction, we forgot to increase it in conjunction with the increase for the lot size. And as a result, it's too low. And so now keepers will not rationally bid on the auction until that discount has kicked in a couple times, which means that the bad debt would sit in the queue for a number of days. This isn't anything technically bad, but it's definitely something we want to avoid. And if we have time to clean this up before launch, and we do, we definitely should. So I'll pause here for some questions. So two separate issues, the second one being slightly more important. All right, well, I'm not sure if kind of the implication of this has come across as well as I'd like, but essentially, I mean, we put out a governance poll, and we don't want to launch an executive with, I mean, we definitely can't launch an executive with parameters that are different from what was voted on the governance poll. So we're just gonna have to kind of run a quick fix governance poll that inserts this missing parameter, which was carelessly left off, and then fix the bid duration. I mean, the maximum bid as well.
All right, thanks, Cyrus. I think I might just jump in here just to, yeah, so that's the situation that we're in. We have one additional weekly cadence of governance we can utilize between now and launch. So next week we'll be having a stability fee poll as usual, and a cleanup poll. And that cleanup poll, my preference will be, but we're still debating, will probably be these two parameters corrected and or added as a rider in a new, or not as a rider, but in a new poll, and then that will position us to be able to launch or have the executive, sorry, on the 15th, and the community will be able to ratify the risk construct in its pristine and final form. But as Cyrus pointed out, there are debates in the forums, or at least explanations and details in the forums. So if there's contention or confusion or issues that people want to bring up, please do. I forgot to talk about it in the preamble, but at the top of the hour, we're actually getting pretty tight on time, but sometime after the top of the hour or we will have a freeform Q&A session. So we touched on a lot of really tasty issues actually today. So if anybody watching this has come up with a question or a thought or a comment that they want to address but didn't find the right time, don't despair. There's going to be a general Q&A in a bit. But before we do that, Vishesh, are you around to show us some graphs? And do we have any bets on what his state of charge is today?
100%.
100? I don't know. I think 70.
I'm shooting for low. I'm shooting low.
He messes it up. I think he does it on purpose.
I'm short on his battery life.
I think he might be at 0. Maybe that's why he's not. All right. Well, maybe while we're waiting for Vishesh to plug in the right cable. David, did we get, is LongForWisdom here, or is he still dealing with power problems?
If he doesn't speak up in a second, I think I'm gonna steal his section and talk a little bit about governance at a glance.
All right, yeah. So let's try and keep that one super speedy, and then take it away, David. Go and do for us.
Yeah, sure. So I haven't really been paying attention too closely, but in the gist of it is that LongForWisdom actually posted a couple of interesting threads, including like one thread on effective productivity in the DAO, and he had this kind of this theory of do things first and ask for forgiveness later, and that's kind of like really generalizing it. I highly suggest you guys read the post. Some of the other new active discussions that arise this week were the inclusion of a DAI stability index to MKR holder risk profile by Pat. So he opened the discussion around how to ensure that we get more MKR to vote about directly incentivizing keeping the DAI peg. This actually arose from the discussion we had towards the end of the call last week. So Pat went on and made a thread like Rich gave him the action item to do. So that was pretty cool. We had a new Maker governance analytics dashboard, and there's a thread there accompanying it. I know the guys at Protofire are looking for feedback, so definitely add feedback in that thread. There was also the Uni V1 Uniswap liquidity tokens as collateral thread. This is super interesting. I know that our community has been considering liquidity tokens kind of from afar, and this thread gives us a chance to dive into it and get some of these pros and cons and considerations on paper, so to speak. Yeah, there was Cyrus posted the migration risk construct not just on the proposal, but also on the forum. I don't know if there was too much discussion in that thread. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If I'm missing anything, like glaringly obvious, feel free to jump in. But that's the gist of the most pressing stuff or the most active stuff this week on the forum.
All right, thanks, David. I've posted a link to the Governance at a Glance thread. I've also, I can't believe I forgot to talk about this, the governance dashboard went live this week. There's a lot to be digested there, and I encourage everybody who's interested in how governance works at MakerDAO, or just governance in general, because we're blazing some new territory here. And there's things to be learned from figuring out how engagement works and who votes for what and how often they vote and how often they change their votes and what capitulation looks like in this space. And there's some, I talked at the top of the hour about some of the stress cracks that might be forming here. And this is going to be a great tool to help us identify where some of those things are and what can be improved. This is a living project. So this is phase one. Phase two is on its way out the door. Or actually, on the way out the door is the plan for phase two is on its way out the door, but it's never too late. So please have a look at this tool. We're soliciting the community, or the team that built it is soliciting the community to improve it. So if there's things that this group would like to see, additions, tweaks, or fixes, please join us in the forums. There's a thread there about it. And offer up your suggestions. I think that this kind of thing is going to be critical for us to identify issues around engagement and who's doing what and when and why, and allow us to subdivide some emerging categories of users. We're going to start dealing with demographics of users more than we have in the past. And we've touched on this in previous calls, but there's a world forming, which will become more apparent as it self-organizes. But we're going to see parties form eventually, where we have hawks and doves and conservatives and YOLOers, or what, I don't know what we're going to call them. But this will help us identify major stakeholders in the system. So please have a look at that tool. All right.
Oh, actually, hold on. Also, in regards to that tool, if you guys want to see a run through of it, like a really good run through of it, one of the guys, Leonardo from Protofire, from the team that built it, on Tuesdays, this past Tuesday's community call, we had him on, and the first half an hour of that call is him running through that dashboard and exploring some of the features. So definitely check that out. It's on our YouTube. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
Are you using my call to do a commercial for your call? Is that what just happened?
Yeah, synergy, bro, synergy.
Bold. All right. Vishesh, are you sorted here? It does not look like it. All right. Cyrus, you want to give us a state of the fact? Oh, he just turned green. Is he there?
Hey, can you hear me?
Oh, there he goes. Yeah.
Excellent. I just had to completely restart my machine to make that work.
Did you is that what happened?
Yeah, who knows why. Cool. So let me just script again real quick. Okay. Yeah, so state of the yeah, long story short,
Are you sharing your screen? I'm not seeing anything.
Yeah, it's taking a moment.
There we go.
So yeah, first and foremost, we hit the debt ceiling. So that's the big notable for this week. I mean, supply just exploded. We saw since the 4th a roughly 10 million DAI increase in supply, which is particularly interesting considering that the total amount of borrow volume that we saw drop from secondary lending platforms was, say, 12 million for Compound and then maybe 1 million for DYDX. So, say 13 million in secondary lending volume dropped, but only 10 million increased in total supply. So not all of what's been going on is perfectly explained by refinancing, which is particularly interesting. So one of the things that we've kind of been talking about is this buffer that has existed between the stability fee and the compound borrow rate. And that's been something that's been really interesting to watch, because as the stability fee dropped from 12 to 10 to 9 to 5, the compound borrow rate stayed pretty steady between 13 to 11.8. And then very recently, very suddenly, on the 4th, we saw a huge dip. Well, not huge, say 1.6%, but percentage-wise, that's pretty significant. Dip in the compound borrow rate, primarily because that volume came down from, say, 22 million to 16 million. So 12 out of 22, more or less, which is a pretty significant percentage. So what's interesting is, though that supply shot up through a few very large mintings on the 4th, and then a little bit on the 5th, and again on the 6th, we didn't see the DAI price necessarily crater. So that increased supply did not just immediately make its way onto the market, which sort of begs the, and so this is the other view, is the 7-day. So again, more or less stable at peg, and actually not a huge trading volume on those dexes. So and Coinbase. And so what's interesting is, though there was a large supply that was pulled out, it has not yet necessarily made its way right onto the market, which kind of begs the question of how that DAI is being used, because it's not immediately being sold for collateral to re-up on leverage. Now, it's also possible that a fair number of people have kind of gotten the message that there will be a liquidity crunch on single collateral DAI, and so like perhaps some folks are just pulling some out to hold on to it at a relatively cheap rate. Some folks obviously did refinance some of this 12 million dip over to Maker CDP positions because they're just cheaper, and that part makes sense. It's fascinating to consider the remaining 16 or 17 million that are still sitting at a higher interest rate. Partly, again, people have been kind of theorizing about this, but partly due to different risk parameters that are available, and so ultimately a different risk profile that people would have access to, potentially partly due to the fact that they may be using different collateral assets to back these positions, and so it's just not worth the cost and the accepted risk for switching, and so they're willing to pay those few extra points in an interest rate. But that supply volume has also not moved significantly. So again, that DAI that's been drawn out, it's not like it was immediately dumped back onto something like Compound to be lent out again. So it is more or less sitting there being held, unless someone knows of which contracts it's been dumped into recently. But it will be interesting to see what happens with that most recent 10 million. Whether it does get slowly sold onto the market for collateral, whether it's held onto and is just inventories for some market maker out there that wants to try to arbitrage a profit. It will be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, by extension, DYDX utilization rates, slight dip, compound utilization rates have gone even lower, down to 43%. So very interesting to see what's been going on with compound lately. But yeah, so on the price side, like I mentioned, a pretty normal curve of what we might expect. Uniswap sort of slipping down into some of those lower prices. So obviously there is some DAI that was sold on the market and sold at some lower rates. I'm guessing that was primarily due to slippage. But yeah, Oasis and Radar Relay and Coinbase kind of sitting squarely where we usually expect them, between 999 and $1.01, more or less. So price is comparatively stable, though at low volumes. So what I would expect to see potentially over the next few days or week is maybe some of that volume making its way onto the market. And it will be interesting to see how stable the price stays during that, or whether it'll be unclear whether that DAI is just sold to take a profit or whether it's sold for collateral, which will be a really interesting thing to watch. Yeah, so as mentioned, supply shot up. We've talked that to death. Collateral increased commensurately a bit, as we tend to expect when the DAI supply increases. No liquidations recently. The ETH price has been pretty more or less stable during that time frame, though, so that makes sense. Yeah, and so just in the grand scheme of things, this time frame from end of July to beginning of November was a dip in the rate of growth of debt that has ticked back up. I'm not 100% certain how sustained this 10 million increase will be, because as we have talked about in the past, and one thing that we have not touched on in a while is the degree of this oversupply. So the 22-ish million of excess supply that's just sitting there on platforms like Compound, that is still a buffer that exists. So theoretically, if we hit the debt ceiling, if people are unable to source DAI, like theoretically you can source it from here. It does become a little bit trickier, and this is why we were in the past really interested in that rate differential. It does become trickier when the rates are more expensive on something like Compound than they are on Maker. And so this has kind of put us back into the state of like a little bit of an economic anomaly, where you would have expected that rate arbitrage to occur, but it has not occurred. So this excess supply is not very effective at the moment, I think, at shielding DAI from the potential effects of oversupply in terms of depressing the price, because it is more expensive. And so people are not necessarily going to go and seek this 21 million if we hit the debt ceiling, or as we have hit the debt ceiling. So as that debt ceiling becomes increased, I think there is the potential that we're accumulating some economic risk there. So that's just something to keep an eye on. Okay. I will answer any questions if there are. Otherwise, we can move on.
All right, I'll ask a question that might not be directed specifically to you, Vishesh, but it ties into something that I wanted to talk about at the top of the hour, where I'm going to keep on hammering this thing to death. So we have stress cracks forming in the governance system. And one of the things that the community has yet to internalize, at least as far as I'm concerned, I might be wrong, we have a poll on Monday. We have an executive on Friday. That's fairly clean. There's system. We've run into a couple of issues, but not too many. But here's the deal. Each Friday we vote on one issue. We vote on that stability fee. We're rapidly moving into a world where we're going to be voting on multiple polls. Those polls will be wrapped up into a single executive. And this week we're going to see the first example of that, where the poll will be whatever the stability fee was. I believe it's probably 5, I think, was voted in or polled in earlier today. And a stability fee increased to debt ceiling increased to 120. So now we have double the complexity. So what happens to this community if we have a series of polls, they get rolled up, and some of those poll items are potentially mutually exclusive, or if not mechanically exclusive, create contention and friction against each other. So we'll have a group of people that believe this debt ceiling should be raised, and a bunch of people that believe the debt ceiling or the stability fee should not be moved. Does that create weak executives? Does that lower engagement? Does that spread Maker across more executives than we'd like, and therefore lower the security of the system? These are all super tricky questions to answer, and we're going to have to face them square on post-NGD launch. But the reason why I'm bringing that up now is that we have this mechanism. Let's raise the debt ceiling when we hit the debt ceiling, because obviously if there's a requirement for more DAI, we should satisfy that requirement if it doesn't incur risk to the system. So easy peasy. But, and I was just reading this in the chat, this is why this is an example. What if people are drawing DAI because they're planning to do some nefarious activities? They believe there's going to be a crunch on side and they want to hold as much as they can to potentially profit off that. So here we go, today or tomorrow, to launch an executive to raise that debt ceiling to provide these potential speculators even more side that they can hoard in order to do something we might not like as a community post-launch. So we're running into situations where a lot of this stuff isn't going to be cut and dry. So it's something to consider as we start stuffing more and more things into the executive. Vishesh, did you have any suggestions or any opinions on whether people might be hoarding, or what do you think the activity is here? Why are people drawing so much DAI? Just simple refinance?
It does not appear to be, well, what I was saying earlier was it does not mathematically, like pigeonhole principle, can't completely be refinancing. The other point was, I do think there's likely some degree, I mean, we can debate how much, of hoarding behavior going on. Could partly be due to fear of risk for some reason, that people don't want to themselves be subject to that liquidity crunch. And so like it's a balance between nefarious, I don't know, maybe is not the right word, but probably a balance between like profit-seeking behavior and like fear and risk and preparation. But I do think that it's not like the demand curve suddenly jumped up, you know, by more than 11% overnight. I do think it's not a coincidence that this has happened just before migration and just post a bunch of announcements about migration stuff. So yeah, you know, it's Occam's razor, like it's very unlikely for those things to be unrelated, but again, guessing at people's incentives and their reasoning is always tricky. I do think the reasons may be varied, but the hoarding behavior appears to track with what we're seeing in the data. I mean, like if that DAI was not immediately dumped onto the market for more ETH or, you know, for USDC or something like that, then it must be hoarding, right? By extension, unless people just are waiting a really long time to trade on it. But I don't think we've really seen that case where a large amount of DAI is drawn out and then many days later is exchanged for ETH or is slow release, etc. Like people tend to make those trades pretty quickly, I think, based on what we've seen in the past. So it is probably pretty likely that it's being hoarded.
That's interesting. So, and we're about to give them 20 million more DAI to hoard. So it'll be interesting to see what happens after the.
That's the thing that I just want to make sure that like we're considering the risks of is if you're going to increase that supply cap, why? Like, why are you increasing that supply cap? And by how much is another very important discussion. And like, I don't see any reason why demand would have suddenly increased overnight. And so you're potentially just contributing more to oversupply. But answering that question has become trickier because there's this weird thing going on with the secondary lending rates. And so you don't have, like, you can't just point to the 22 million that's sitting on Compound and say, that's the amount of oversupply, because the rates are different now. If it was cheaper on Compound than it is on Maker, then you could point to that as a buffer and say, hey, this is roughly the size of that buffer. But right now it's very unpredictable because you can't rely on that in a one-to-one way that you probably could have in the past.
Yeah, well, interesting questions. I can provide no answers to them. It's something to watch, though. I think that assuming the worst, we do have, there's an upper bound on how much we can move the single collateral DAI debt ceiling, because this comes back to the judiciary thing that I was talking about at the beginning of the call, is that we have to adhere as closely to the wording of these proposals as possible. I don't want to interpret them. And the wording of the proposal states fairly clearly, very clearly, that the debt ceiling increase plan expires at the launch of MCD. So we'll be moving to managing those two debt ceilings, I think, more granularly post-launch. So hopefully we don't hit the 120 million cap by next Monday, and then we won't have to raise it again. All right. Thanks, Vishesh. So let's we have 13 minutes for general Q&A, and I think that regular viewers of this call will know how terrifying I find awkward silences. So forgive me if I turn off my camera to hide the visible sweating. But if people do have questions or comments or things that they've typed into the chat that they feel weren't addressed or they want to expand on, please feel free to jump on the microphone now or repeat your questions, and we can dig into them a little bit more. I know, Lawson, if you're still on the call, you were referencing an ancient debate that we've been having around these parts about automation versus human interaction, which is an interesting discussion we could possibly dig into a bit, specifically as it relates to governance. Generally, we talk about magic algorithms when it comes to the risk parameters, but there's some magic algorithm talks to be had about how we deal with governance itself. Let's see, what else did we have in the call here? I mean, in the chat.
While people aren't asking questions, I also want to take this chance to shill the community call on Tuesdays a little bit more. Lolike is from our integrations team is going to be on the call on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, to talk also a bit about migration. So if you're just generally an integrations partner or somebody who independently integrated or even users, I'm going to be there as well, obviously. So we're going to dedicate the first half of the call also just to migration, to give the community a bit more of a venue to ask questions if they have them.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, there's lots of, I'm kidding around, obviously. There's a ton of good content in the community call. So if you're interested in MakerDAO, it's a great way to speak directly to some of the larger third-party ecosystem actors, people that are doing stuff, building stuff for us, but also our internal resources as well. I noticed that Andrew has his hyperlapse going again. You can always count on him.
Always and forever.
We could just watch him perform some errands for a while.
Oh, what's up, guys?
Wait, are you at my house? Oh, God.
I just heard his doorbell go on. That's a keeper. All right. We might leave it there then, because I don't think there's going to be a lot of activity. So if people want to internalize some of the things that we chatted about, let's improve governance. Let's give it some thought about what's going to work for us and how we need things to be improved. Let's revisit the forums, follow the interesting chats that are happening there, dig into the migration plan if you haven't done it yet. The name is a bit of a misnomer. I think that some people might not have internalized it. That migration risk construct. Hey, Andrew, just chilling on the couch. The migration risk construct is more than a risk construct. That's what MCD looks like. Maybe we should have put exclamation marks and big stars around the title when we posted that. But if you want to know what MCD looks like, read the migration construct, and then let us know what you think. And then next week we'll
read the auction guides that David posted in the chat as well. And we can continue talking about auctions and other system parameters in the weeks to come. Yeah,
auctions are big. I'm fascinated by it, but they're complicated and it's a lot to wrap your head around. And that's how we get bad debt out of the system or bad collateral out. So it's a big one. We need to figure that out and make sure that people understand how it works. Please have a look. All right, let's call it there, because I think Dave and Andrew want to have their tea party, whatever it is that they're up to today, and we can regroup next week. Have a look. Keep your eyes out for the executive. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for the awesome call.
Bye, guys.